What is Steve Witkoff doing there? God, if Trump wasn't real and we were simply watching this as like a televised event, it would be so funny. Trump tells Ukraine, you should have never started the war. You could have given up land. Yeah. Trump's statements today were pretty insane. Especially considering, like, you know, you're the president of America. You can't say that. It's like, that is an insane thing to say.
Trump has said that he believes he has the power to end the war in Ukraine. He was speaking after talks were held today in Saudi Arabia, where Russian and American diplomats discussed ending Russia's 3-year campaign. More on those talks in a moment. But first, let's go straight to Washington and to our North America editor, Sarah Smith. Sarah, what more did the president say?
Well, he said he thinks he's the only person in the world who can end this war, as well as saying that he has the power to end it, and also repeating that if he had been in the White House 3 years ago, this war would never have begun. Now, he's said that before, but he's always implied that that was because Vladimir Putin would not have dared to invade Ukraine if Donald Trump had been the president of the United States. But speaking a few minutes ago from his Florida residence in Mar-a-Lago, he seemed to be blaming Ukraine for not having made a deal with Russia prior to the invasion. He seemed to be saying that if he had been in office, then he would have forced the deal that anybody, he said, could have negotiated a better deal where they would have given up a little bit of land, not too much, and been able to avoid this war. Have a listen to what he had to say.
I think I have the power to end this war, and I think it's going very well. But today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed, and no city would have been demolished, and not one dome would have been knocked down. But they chose not.
That's my goat, dude. He's just different. Art of the deal, baby. Art of the deal. He would have given him almost all of the land. Not all of it, but almost all of it. If only Ukraine hadn't started the war by just kind of existing there.
Not to do it that way.
Like, America has more responsibility in this process than even Ukraine does.
Now, of course, when he was...
Yeah, this is my favorite pro-Russian argument, by the way. Ukraine government and military shouldn't have slaughtered their Donbass population on and off between 2014 and 2022. Yeah, they should have let the Russian military do that instead to virtually every part of eastern Ukraine. I'm so glad that Russia saved all of those ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine by invading eastern Ukraine and turning every city into rubble. That's not what I'm saying. Okay. Yeah. Even if that's your position, once again, who is goading Ukraine at that point? You think the Ukrainian government is doing that on its own? No, of course not. That's why it's when Donald Trump says like that.
Was saying that Ukraine was complaining about not being invited. That was because they were not part of those talks that took place between America and Russia in Saudi Arabia today. Now, from the State Department, from Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, we heard that those were not negotiations about how to end the war. They were simply initial talks between America and Russia, who will now put together top teams who will speak to each other about the parameters of how the war might end. And the Secretary of State was...
They were shelling Donbass for 8 years. What the hell are you talking about? You think I don't know that? Yes, I know. 14,000 people. I know that. Okay. Russia liberated those places by basically blowing up every other surrounding city as well, by killing literally 10x more minimum.
It's very clear. He said if they do get to the point of actually negotiating what a peace deal or a ceasefire might look like, at that point Ukraine will be brought into the talks and some European nations will be consulted. But for now, those talks are very much...
The most important question about the peace talks, will Turkey be at the table? No, I'm actually very upset with Donald Trump about that. Nothing else, just that. They went to the Saudis. They went to the Saudis instead. And I personally think that's gross. Okay? Turkey is not at the table. Turkey is the table. Okay? We are the table. It's really messed up.
It's between only the United States and Russia.
Thank you very much, Sarah Smith there in Washington.
What does Israel do here now that America and Russia are publicly buddy-buddy? What? Do you know how much Israel loves Russia? What are you talking about? What? Oh man, it's going to be really sad when all of the Russian-Israeli dual nationals will be able to freely go back and forth again now that their assets are not threatened with seizure, or rather, you know, all of the Russian nationals won't have to use their Israeli passports to freely travel to Western Europe now. That's what's going to happen. Like, Israel aids Ukraine versus Iran and Russia in Ukraine. Yeah, Israel is Russia too. It's kind of funny because I had a conversation with Sam Cedar a while back, if you remember, and he literally said Israel is so violent because of all the ethnic Russians that came to Israel once. And I was like, I don't know about that, Sam. I mean, there are a lot of Russians in Israel. That is true. This part is correct. But I don't think it was the ethnic Russians that made Israel more aggressive towards Palestinians.
Well, there were extraordinary scenes in Saudi Arabia where Russian and American diplomats on opposite sides for so many years held 4 hours of talks aimed at ending the war in Ukraine. One of those at the table, the Russian foreign minister, is even under US sanctions for the part he's played in the war. The two countries agreed to press ahead with negotiations. The talks are part of a flurry of diplomacy focused on Ukraine this week. Crucially, as you heard, neither Ukraine nor Europe were invited to the talks with US and Russian officials, which took place in Riyadh this morning. Instead, the US envoy Keith Kellogg is being dispatched to meet Ukrainian officials separately in Kyiv. And while Russia and the US were talking, Ukraine's President Zelensky was in Turkey with President Erdogan.
We're at the table. We're still at the table. Let's go. That's really fucked up. That is really fucked up that they just basically sent Zelensky to Turkey. Like, Saudi Arabia gets to be the table where you're talking to Vladimir Putin, and then Turkey gets Zelensky. What kind of shit is this? This man literally facilitated the demise of the Assad regime, and this is how the Trump administration pays him back. Okay, they're like, here's a consolation prize. We don't want him anymore. You go play with Zelensky. Make yourself feel cool. I mean, seriously, one of the greatest W's for the American foreign policy came as a consequence of that dip right there. Okay, he gave it to you. Major W. Okay, major W. And instead of doing another plan in Turkey, you go to Saudi Arabia. What did they do? They just have oil. What did they do? We have the best watermelon salesman, okay? It's actually racist. It's actually anti-Turkish discrimination. Once again, the goddamn Angloids betray the Turks and think that the House of Saud is going to be more helpful in their desires for the region. Constantly undermine. I don't know that an ex-ISIS guy is a major W. No, it's not a major W for me or for the Syrian population, potentially long term. I'm just saying for American foreign policy, that was a major W. Donald Trump, the loyal servant of the West, unironically handed that to them. And what did he get? You know what I mean? He doesn't even get he doesn't get a seat at the table? Really? That's fucked up. Yeah, also, he wasn't ex-ISIS. He was ex-Al-Qaeda. Get it right, okay? You are undermining your most valuable asset in the region, sir. Let me tell you, Turkey is not simply a junior partner in this coalition. Turkey is not simply a man you demand a seat at the table, a man you simply invite to the table. Turkey is the table, okay? Oh, well, Erdogan supports Israel? Of course he does. What do you mean? Oh, so much. He literally does. It's so funny that everybody thinks he's like anti-Israel because he'll be like, oh, you, Netanyahu, you are Satan. And then everyone's like, yeah, he's so brave. Thank God. Thank God for this brave boy speaking out against Israel. It's like his son literally is still sending like his own ships into Israel. Anyway, everything I just said was a joke for the record about, well, not the Israel stuff. That was real. But the other stuff about Turkey being undermined and not being at the seat, not getting a seat at the table.
Yesterday, European leaders held an emergency summit in Paris to discuss Ukraine and European security, underlining the unease being felt about President Trump's plans to resolve the war. Our State Department correspondent Tom Bateman is travelling with the American delegation and has been covering the meeting in Riyadh.
Weren't you also in support of ISIS while the Kurds were fighting them off? What? No. What are you saying? No, I'm in support of the Kurds, you idiot. What are you saying? Oh, you said weren't they? I thought you were talking about me. Yes, they were. And they still are. What are you talking about?
Face to face in a Saudi royal palace, a picture that makes history. Here was the US, the biggest single backer.
Do you want to watch the Elon Trump interview live in 10 minutes or wait for the YouTube video tomorrow? YouTube video
Ukraine,
tomorrow.
Sitting down with its friend's enemy, Russia. Both sides were silent and stony-faced for the media, but Vladimir Putin's team clearly happy that President Trump had ended their isolation.
Yeah, clearly. Look at Lavrov. Look at how happy he is. Yeah. This man hasn't laughed since 1987, okay? That's the last time he laughed on the record. The f*** you mean he's happy?
Trump had ended their isolation.
How could he be happy? He's standing in front of a giant, okay? He's standing in front of a giant. Donald Trump's golfing partner, Steve Witkoff, famous real estate developer. Blessed he, the peacekeeper, the peacemaker.
And the world was about to be shown it.
We were brought in for a short amount of time at the very start of the meeting. So the doors opened, the press brought in, and then we saw that extraordinary scene. The first time any such face-to-face meeting has taken place at that level in 3 years.
Amid the surging anxiety in Europe over these talks, I shouted questions for Marco Rubio.
Yeah, Marco Rubio is honored, okay? Honored to be in the presence of a real foreign policy demon. Teach him a thing or two, Steve. Give it to him, Steve. Little Marco, you're going to learn a thing or two.
Is the US sidelining Ukraine, Mr. Secretary? What concessions will there be asked of Russia, Mr. Secretary?
There was no answer, and the doors were firmly closed. If the US was demanding any concessions of Moscow, they weren't telling anyone else today. The Americans called the talks upbeat and constructive. They even had time to eat with the foreign minister they sanction. After this break, there was a working lunch, a symphony of scallops and ribeye steak on the menu.
I came away today convinced that they are willing to begin to engage in a serious process to determine how and how quickly and through what mechanism can an end be brought to this war. Whether we can ultimately reach that outcome will obviously depend on every side in this conflict's willingness to.
I don't know why they didn't let Pete Hegseth show up to this one. I feel like he could have played a formative role in these talks. They should have brought him too. I mean, you brought Steve. The f*** is Steve Witkoff doing there, man? What does he know about Israel, Palestine? What does he know about Ukraine? What is Steve Witkoff doing there? God, if Trump wasn't real and we were simply watching this as like a televised event, it would be so funny. Like, it's just, that's his little guy, okay? That's literally his guy. He's just like, that's my little guy. That's my Steve. I like him. So he's going everywhere in my stead. That's all this is. That's it. That's what it is. He just trusts Steve because they play golf and he doesn't cheat, I think. I suspect. That's probably what it is. Yeah, he's just no longer sending Jared because Jared already shellacked the Saudis for all of their sweet oil money. Jared milked them dry, so now he has to get a new guy in. That's it. That's him. He's the little guy, Steve.
To agree to certain things.
Russia's foreign minister said both sides had listened and heard each other, but gave no sign of conceding anything, demanding not only that Ukraine could never join NATO, but that Russia wouldn't tolerate any Western force there.
We explained today the appearance of armed forces from NATO countries under a foreign flag under the flag of the European Union or under national flags does not change anything in this regard. This is, of course, unacceptable to us.
So Russia moved from being pariah to partner, the US insisting no one.
You think they talked about how Vladimir Putin opened the world's oldest vault and proved once and for all that Jesus was black? Like, even for a little. You think Lavrov brought it up? I think so.
One is being sidelined, but the negotiating table was just as notable for who wasn't invited: no Ukrainians nor Europeans. President Zelensky was instead in Turkey. He's cancelled a planned trip to Saudi Arabia.
I am convinced that for Ukraine and for our region, for Europe, that it is critical that any negotiations to end the war are not happening behind the backs of the key parties affected by the Russian aggression.
A stark reminder of that before the talks as Russia launched another mass drone attack on Kyiv and elsewhere overnight. Today's events have so far done nothing to allay the biggest fears in Ukraine.
That's crazy, dude. That's crazy. They made him sit at the kids' table. That's crazy.
Ukraine of being forced to accept an end to war on Russia's terms, with the peace being carved up between Moscow and Washington. Tom Bateman, BBC News, Riyadh.
Well, in a moment, we'll speak to our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg. But first, let's go to our Ukraine correspondent, James Waterhouse, who's in Kyiv for us. And James, how are President Trump's latest comments likely to be received there?
Well, to give you an idea, 3 years ago, it was very difficult for Ukrainians to hear Vladimir Putin announce that he was going.
Isn't it just USA and NATO losing, basically? Yeah. The United States lost so much, dude. It's crazy. They were able to shut off a massive competitor and its pipeline project to more efficiently deal energy into the European market and force the Europeans to either purchase it with an upmark from other countries in the region or directly get it from the United States of America. The American military-industrial complex was able to dump a ton of older weapons and equipment to Ukraine and is now going to basically pick apart Ukrainian natural resources, aside from, purchasing all of the other state-owned enterprises at pennies on the dollar for Western capital. Is really, really devastating for America. No, America made out like a bandit. It's new. Russia's military suffered 530,000 casualties in 2024, a NATO official said. That's nearly two-thirds of Russian troops killed or wounded in Ukraine since 2022. Russia's casualty count is now 837,000 killed or wounded, nearly 3 years since the Kremlin's full-scale invasion. I don't know what this information is, man. I never know. You just don't know. I don't trust anybody's numbers. Does this mean that Biden was actually the go to the American military-industrial petro complex? No, because he wouldn't have had any of this shit if Vladimir Putin wasn't a dumbass who turned around and invaded Ukraine. Like, that's why I kept saying Vladimir Putin handed a gift to America, like a major gift. Yeah, I did know that Biden doesn't even have a PhD in foreign policy. He's just that good. Sure, Russia lost 1 million soldiers and are still winning. I mean, I don't know if they actually lost 1 million soldiers, okay, wounded or dead. I don't know if that's the truth or not, but it doesn't matter. Of course, Russia lost a ton of soldiers, like regardless of whether it's 1 million or not. They did.
Going to denazify Ukraine by sending in 150,000 troops. They were words and actions that spread fear and anxiety across this country, fears that have endured with the full-scale invasion. Most Ukrainians do not believe the assertion that Russia is ready for peace, despite America and Donald Trump coming to that conclusion repeatedly over the past week as it asserts its new foreign policy. We've just been in the shelter for an hour on another common night where dozens of drones have been launched across Ukraine. Now, we have heard Donald Trump tonight say Ukraine shouldn't have started this war, that it should have traded land early on, as you have heard. It was Russia that launched a full-scale invasion off the back of 8 years of aggression towards Ukraine when it seized Crimea. these are words that you would expect to come from the Kremlin. Donald Trump talked about elections not being held for a while. It is close to repeating the Kremlin's false claims that President Zelensky is an illegitimate leader when elections have legally been postponed under martial law enshrined in Ukraine's constitution. I think the words of Donald Trump reflect the fewer places Ukraine has to look as it continues fighting this invasion. President Zelensky says he can't do it without weapons. He can't do it without America's help. In Turkey today, he looked visibly irritated, tired, and he argued that you can't have negotiations about Europe and Ukrainian security without either party being involved.
And Steve, by contrast, Russia must feel that this is all going their way.
Yeah, the Russians are delighted, I think, by how things have gone today. I mean, they believe that they've already scored a diplomatic...
There's no good reason elections haven't been held. It happens in wartime all the time. No, I think it's understandable. That's the one thing that I disagree with. I think in terms of like banning political parties by claiming that they have sympathies for Russia is one thing. That I think is undemocratic. But it does make sense that they wouldn't hold an election, especially when there's plenty of territory that is now literally annexed by Russia. What are you supposed to do? I don't think it's that. Yeah, there's also so many Ukrainians that are literally not in Ukraine either. You hold elections is what you do. I think that's a weird thing that people constantly push for. Iraq and Afghanistan held elections during occupation. Oh, wow. Yeah, those were definitely really good and very real elections. Like, what are you talking about? And I'm not saying this because I think like Zelensky is super popular or whatever, or that like elections, if they were held, would basically undermine Zelensky. I think it probably would. But regardless, like I do understand why they would maintain martial law. They're invaded. Having a fair election seems democratic. I think it's really funny that a lot of these people say like, a lot of these people are like, oh, why didn't they have an election? But I don't know what the current Ukrainian politics looks like, but I don't think that like the process of democratic elections in this instance would bring forth a figurehead that is better for Russian interests or better for anyone really. Like, I just don't think that it would be a fair election regardless, especially when you have half the goddamn population not in Ukrainian borders at this point, and a decent chunk of the population that is under Russian annexation. Like, that's the one thing that I don't agree with, where I'm like, come on, it's an understandable predicament to not hold elections in this situation.
Victory. The fact that US...
I think that's just a talking point. Latest development is that Ukraine sanctioned Poroshenko because he got the biggest percentage of potential voters in the next election survey, and Ukrainian government said it was because of his attachment to Russia. I think the country is not in a state to hold elections is correct. And not only that, but also, I think Ukraine is cooked with or without elections. Like, they're so cooked. It is a powder keg waiting to explode. You're just against democracy? No, I'm not.
US officials sat down with senior Russian officials while Russia was still waging a war against Ukraine. That is a sign that Western attempts to isolate Russia have failed, and that Russia has come back onto the global stage with its leader. I was watching one of the main political talk shows on Russian state television tonight, and one of the guests stood up and said this. He said, "The events in Riyadh are a triumph for Putin's foreign policy. I congratulate all Russians on having such a president." Well, it was state television. But what about the war in Ukraine? Russia continues to push for an end to the war on Russia's terms, and those terms basically amount to Ukraine giving everything up. And today, the day of the talks, Russia hardened its demands. So now, not only does Russia say no Ukraine in NATO, it's demanding that NATO disavow its promise from 2008 that Ukraine could one day join the NATO alliance.
Steve in Moscow and James in Kiev, thank you both very much.